So we provide training around understanding racism and anti-racist practice. One of the reasons why we have developed a training program of that nature is that we want to kind of shift the thinking beyond unconscious bias. So we're getting professionals and people to kind of understand the kind of context of racism through a black lens. Because when we talk about the notion of racism, it always kind of positions this idea about unconscious biases. And to an extent, that is correct. And if you look at kind of the reports that have come out, let's say over the last, say, 15 years, you know, the recommendations of those reports have said what? You know, that institutionalized racism exists within the UK, you know, it exists within all institutions, and the culture of racism, you know, for some reason continues, you know, whether that be criminal justice, whether that is education, whether that is sporting organizations, whether that will be in housing associations, local community. You know, we live in a racialized social structure where people are impacted by racism. However, when we look at the definitions of racism, we always look at the definitions through the lens of Eurocentric scholarship, through Europeans. So our understanding is on the basis that racism is based on prejudice. But what we don't then look at is how is racism looked upon through black scholarship. And when I say black scholarship, I'm talking about equal PhDs, doctors that have researched and documented through those kind of frontline experiences between individuals and peoples across the world. And when you look at black scholarship versus European scholarship, for example, you notice that the dynamic of power is utilized. So it's not just about prejudice, it's also about the notion of power and the way in which power is utilized in all forms of human activity. So what it then does is it forces us to then not just look at the notion of prejudice, which when you think about the idea of prejudice, generally unconscious bias training is used. And when you look at a number of organizations, those organizations do loads of unconscious bias training. But what is the kind of the critique about unconscious bias training? It's all self-reflective, which is good. It gets you to think about the way that you think, the way that you may behave, the way that you may respond to particular individuals or situations based on things that are either conscious or subconscious to you. But what anti-racist practice is all about is it's about action. It's about forcing you to think about the things in which you may do and how do you, positively respond to particular issues that you may be ultimately faced with. So it's not about self-reflection, it's about the action and what does that action look like. So our training programs get professionals, organizations to think about what those positive and proactive steps may be. And I guess the reality is that when people talk about the notion of race and racism, you know, it is an uncomfortable conversation. You know, it is a conversation that oftentimes people don't want to discuss. You know, people feel that they have a privilege. People feel quite fragile when they talk about that. So oftentimes we kind of have a dismissive conversations about racism. But when you look at your policies and procedures and it talks about, you know, equality and diversity, and it talks about all forms of discrimination, you know, race is also a part of that. But what often happens, unfortunately, is we look at things like disability, we look at things like, you know, sexuality and gender and all of those things that are important when we're talking about discrimination, but race always ends up at the bottom. So our work is getting organizations to enable the idea of racism and how the culture of racism exists within our society and having an equal shot, because what we're talking about is not just, you know, one, you know, aspect of discrimination being over another. You know, we're talking about fairness, we're talking about equality, we're talking about justice, and most importantly, doing the right thing.